Hello, and welcome to the Artfully Learning audio series. I'm your host, Adam Zucker. Art, education, and philosophy are intrinsically linked, as they each utilize a certain vocabulary and experiential means to explore fundamental questions such as those concerning existence, reason, knowledge, values, and syntax. In fact, professional artists and educators often create statements explaining their logical intent behind the work they do in the studio, classroom, or community. In all of these disciplines, time is an important construct. Philosophy has wrestled with the question of time and how we experience it. Does time have a substance? And if so, what is it made of? How do we know that time really exists? Does time have a beginning and an end? Is it a straight line or a circle? While these are often abstract and complex inquiries, art might have some potential answers in the form of tangible visual responses to these questions. Art is a record of the lived experience, and therefore is a reflection of specific moments in time. An artwork's documentation of time is twofold, in that it depicts the contemporaneous action of the artist's process, while also establishing a temporal account of the era and cultural zeitgeist when the work was created. Furthermore, art often outlasts its creator, and therefore becomes a part of future eras and later discourse, interpretation, and analysis. Kerry Langsdale is a philosopher and artist. She is currently a PhD researcher at the University of Nottingham, with a focus on the metaphysics of time. Her research and love for art has inspired an ongoing project called The Art of Time. The Art of Time is an art-centered collaboration with both working artists and the public, exploring the philosophy of time through the lens of contemporary fine art. The intention is for the Art of Time series to be mutually beneficial for both philosophy and art. Langsdale supports artists to explore themes of time and temporality in their own practice. This process is tailored to the artists and has included delving into time as an underpinning context of the work and experimenting with time-based media and materials. So without further ado, it's time to bring Kerry Langsdale onto the program.
Hello.
Hello. Hey, Kerry. Good morning.
Hi. Hello.
Or good afternoon.
Good morning / afternoon to you. How are we?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Pleasure to be connecting with you.
You too. Thank you for chatting with me.
I'm really excited about this because generally we educators and artists do not tackle the issues of philosophy from an actual philosopher. Obviously, they're all intrinsic, in my opinion, and I think most people would agree. So it's great to broaden my own horizon. I have a few framework questions, but then the conversation always gets more organic.
Lovely.
We're not going to be like a philosophical debate, I don't think, because
No, that's absolutely fine. I mean, most of my philosophy now is done as public engagement anyway, and specifically it's aimed at non-philosophers. So if anything, I'm more likely to talk about philosophy in that way, which has not helped writing my thesis at all, because I've started to speak really informally about philosophy all of the time, to my supervisor's disappointment. But yeah, I mean, we'll definitely explore it. But I don't like to throw in a ton of philosophical debate or jargon or anything like that. Try and keep it general audience.
That's great. I'm sure that when people hear the word philosophy, that's sort of a daunting word, but it's really part of everyday life. But detaching it from its pedestal in academia is really hard. And I commend you for doing that. And working with artists, of course, which I do want to talk about how that actually helps demystify philosophy. So the first question I want to ask you is, what inspired you to study philosophy? I don't know too many philosophers. I know a lot of artists who are philosophically driven, but I want to know what inspired you to study philosophy. Were there any formative moments during your educational journey that drew you into it?
Yeah, so I think one of the important things you said there is that you don't meet many philosophers, right? Most of us don't really bump into many philosophers in the wild. I certainly get that reaction when I say to people I study philosophy. People think it's really weird. So I definitely never had a moment where I, met someone or I started consciously studying philosophy. It was more something I sort of accidentally fell into. At school, it was sort of 16 and under, I was really interested in religious studies. It was one of the only subjects I was good at and actually paid attention to in school. Mostly because I was really interested in just learning about how different people thought about life and how different people's beliefs were formed and how they lived by them. And I just found that fascinating. And then when I left school and I went on to further study, I didn't really continue with religious studies exactly. It was never a plan to do that, but I found a course that was religious studies, ethics, and philosophy together. And I thought, well, I was good at religious studies, so I'll just carry that on. And I guess the ethics and philosophy, I'll deal with that as it comes up. But then once I started studying philosophy, that was the bit that really captured my attention. That was really interesting. And I suppose because of all of the studies, that was the bit that I couldn't quite wrap my brain around it. It was the rest of it I was really interested in. But for some reason, I'm always drawn towards the things that I find most challenging. It's like my brain doesn't understand this, therefore I need to do it more. Falling into philosophy was definitely an accident for me. I still don't think I've made the decision to be a philosopher yet. I've not. After 15 years of studying, I'm still not there. I still don't know how I feel about it. So I'm definitely still falling down the rabbit hole with this one.
I think that's the perfect response because we're always learning. I mean, I like to say that we're hopefully always learning. If we're not challenging ourselves, we're living this stagnant existence. And on that note, too, talking about being static versus always expanding and this whole idea of lifelong inquiry, you particularly have focused on the philosophy of time, which I know that's a major concept in philosophy. It's also a major concept in the arts and also a major framework of life itself, because we all experience time, and challenging ourselves to become learners over time and gradually learn new things and add new skills is definitely something that I'm interested in. And I know you study, as I said, you're researching the philosophy of time. So what is the philosophy of time, and what insights and theories have you gotten from your current research around time?
Great question. So what is the philosophy of time? I guess firstly, just to complicate matters, it really depends on what discipline or what branch within philosophy that you're looking at, because there's lots of different ways to look at the philosophy of time. So I look at the philosophy of time through the analytic tradition of philosophy. So very briefly, there is kind of an analytic and continental divide in philosophy, which has been there for about the last century or so, a little more. And largely it divides philosophy into two main branches. So you've got your analytical branch, which tries to be very literal, like what is time physically as a feature of the world, what is it? And then you've got the continental side, which is much less to the point. So it's much closer. The continental side tends to be much closer towards the arts and humanities, in that it, rather than being analytical, it likes to synthesize. It likes to say, well, what is time and how can we understand that in relation to our consciousness and in relation to culture and how we live our lives? And it brings in lots of different things. So firstly, when I study the philosophy of time, I study it within the analytic tradition. So I'm very literal. It's almost quite to the point. Physically, what is it, right, as a feature of the world? So I look at questions like, as you said earlier, does time literally pass? Is the present moment in some way special compared to the past or the future? Do past, present, and future times all exist, or do some of them not exist? Like maybe, for example, you might think, well, the present exists. I'm fairly sure of that because I want to say I'm in it. But maybe you might think that the future doesn't exist yet because it hasn't happened yet. So these are the kind of questions that I'm interested in within my tradition, and that's very much within analytical metaphysics. So physically, what is time as a feature of reality, if it's a feature of reality at all?
Yeah, and so you mentioned analytical side, the tangible definitions of time, and then the continental, the more you mentioned it's more art centered in a way. You said the arts are involved in that. So your project, the Art of Time project, it deals maybe more with that continental side then, because you are working with artists. So how did that come about from the analytical perspective? What drew you into then working with artists who are addressing both those aspects of what we know, what we don't know, envisioning what's possible or gaps in our experiences and thinking, and filling in moments in time or revising moments in time? So I think there's a lot there to work with. I mean, revisionist history is something, I don't know if that falls into the philosophy of time. There's a lot. You're working with both concrete and very abstract experiences and thoughts. And I know how my brain works. It's not clear to me too sometimes what is happening in the present moment. I mean, a big thing, I guess, to talk about is being in the now and what that even means. Is that a part of the philosophy of time? I mean, I know that's a very big thing. It's to a lot of people, it's like, I want to be in the now, and meditation and mindfulness and everything too. So there's a lot of differing viewpoints. But I think what I'm interested in is what the Art of Time project is and how it might fuse all of these things together. So if you could just describe a little bit about that, or anything that I touched on that might be pertinent to this discussion.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about the project, and then maybe we'll discuss some of the philosophy that's happening with some of the artists I'm working with. So as you mentioned, I created a project called the Art of Time project. It officially launched about a year ago, but the startings of it have been in the works for quite a while. So the project itself, I want to look at the philosophy of time through the lens of art. So one of the things we look at is what can we learn about the philosophy of time when we look at the subject through different creative mediums and practices. So as I mentioned before, I study the metaphysics of time specifically in the analytic tradition, which is much closer to the natural sciences. And yeah, as you just recapped, the other side of things is the continental, which is much closer to the arts and humanities. So I tend to find with a lot of artists, when they use philosophy within their concepts and their research, as many artists do, right? The idea of artists finding inspiration within philosophy is far from new. But it does tend to be within that continental side of philosophy, because continental philosophy does bring in so many different parts of arts and humanities. It will look at history and politics and culture and art as well. Analytic philosophy very much does not. So analytic philosophy is much more logic-based. So we start from an intuition, and so an intuition might be, well, I feel like I'm in the present. I feel like this is the present moment. Okay, well, let's try to build some theories out of that. So logically, what can we tell about the present moment? Well, maybe it's the place where we exist, or maybe it's somehow special compared to the past and the future. It enjoys some sort of privilege of existence that makes it a special thing, and we go from there. And I think one of the more unique things about the Art of Time project is I am working with artists and creatives, but I am starting from that analytical, that very logical based tradition within philosophy. And so marrying that up with the way that artists and creatives work has been a really steep learning curve, because it hasn't really, I don't know of many projects between analytic philosophers and artists. I'm not going to say there are none out there, but they are hard to find, specifically because they just don't seem to mesh well together compared to the continental side of philosophy. So that has been really challenging, but really interesting. And as you say, being an analytic philosopher, so I have particular areas of interests and concerns about time that I want to look at. And as you said a moment ago, not philosophers, artists will tend to look at things much more from kind of a holistic point of view. So they'll bring in, how do they feel about it? How do they react to it? How does it involve their lives? It tends to be a really, really different way of working. So that's been fascinating to me. But one of the things that I wanted to do with the Art of Time project is really find out more about what people's intuitions about time are, right? And we can talk more about intuitions in a moment, but that was the thing that I really, really wanted to focus on, at least with part of the project, is what are people's concepts of time outside of philosophy? What are people's intuitions about time? And those concepts tend to involve kind of things from both the analytic and continental traditions, if you like. They involve, like, physically, what is the thing, but also how do I react to that thing in real life? So we're kind of dragging in a little bit of both, which is new to me, and a little bit of working with artists, which was new to me. So we're really, I guess when I work with people, we're just kind of trying to pave a new way of thinking about these things.
And there are some artists who do think very literally about time and will make, markings or things to denote the passing of time or the recording of what we know from history or have experienced that can be probably widely accepted. But then again, it comes into, as you mentioned, feelings and social aspects. The emotions are a big part of the arts that differ from philosophical thought, because philosophy, in a way, it's this scientific, logical study. It sounds like you're learning a lot from the artists in the work that they're doing. And maybe we could talk about the intuitiveness of the project. And also, maybe you could describe some of the works, give some examples of the work that you've prompted the artists to create. And I also want to know the benefits of working collaboratively with artists to seek one of the most time-honored, pun intended, philosophical questions. So, yeah, a little bit about what some of the artists are contributing to this project and how you're both learning collaboratively through this process.
Absolutely. So for me, so the Art of Time project is, I call it a project. It's more of a series of different projects. So there's lots of different parts that go into it. And one of the things that I wanted to come out of every part of the project was a kind of mutual benefit for both philosophy and the arts, or art as different disciplines. So I was interested in what we could learn from each other if we worked in different kind of ways. So as an analytic philosopher, one of the things I wanted to know is, well, maybe if we give over our research to creative minds, they'll be able to take it and do something with it and communicate it in different ways to maybe prompt philosophers to think about time in a way that perhaps we hadn't thought about it before, or just allow us to step aside from the theories that we currently have and see if there is a new way forward that maybe we just hadn't thought about because we're not used to thinking in those kinds of ways, right? And then I hope this is the case, but the kind of output I ideally wanted for artists was to be able to access some of the concepts behind the philosophy that they were interested in a little bit more thoroughly and a little bit more rigorously, so that when they're communicating the philosophical concepts like time, they can start from robust theories so that their work is philosophically robust. And there's something, it's not kind of pieced together from what they can find out. Because obviously, as many people will know, philosophy is somewhat exclusive. It still very much has that kind of ivory tower cut off from the rest of the world reputation. And that reputation, although there are some philosophers who are working hard to break that mold, philosophy, in my view, does still deserve that reputation. And so being able to make some of my research accessible to artists so that they can really grapple with the underlying issues in their work is, I hope, useful. So that was kind of the collaborative aspect to it. As for the projects, well, there are a variety of different works. So one of the ones that I guess it would be good to talk about would be a project called Making Time. And this is a public engagement project where I invite creatives and artists and really anybody who wants to come and who feels like they can have a go at being creative. They come to a workshop with me and I share my research, but in very specific ways. So I don't just lecture. I don't just dump my research on people. What I'll do is I'll introduce key concepts and then I'll ask questions and we'll have group discussions over what people feel the answer to those questions are. And it's very much intuition based, right? So you don't have to be an expert philosopher. In fact, the less you know about philosophy for Making Time, the better, because the project is really focused on looking at the folk concept of time. In other words, the concept of time held by non-philosophers. And part of the reason for this is that philosophers use intuition as it's our bread and butter, right? It's our primary evidence. So if we're starting with philosophy, we're going to say, well, what's my intuition about this? And then we're going to build theories from there. And what will happen is that a lot of philosophers, particularly in the philosophy of time, well, all over philosophy, but I noticed it most within my own specialism, of course, is they'll say, well, I have this theory and my theory is a really good theory. It's a really believable theory because it's in keeping with the folk concept of time. And what I was noticing as I was studying is lots of different philosophers with lots of different theories kept saying, well, my theory is really good because it's the folk intuition of time. And I thought, well, hang on a second. You can't all be right. Right. So when you're all saying you all have different contradictory theories and you're all saying it represents how non-philosophers, how people generally think about time, I'm not sure you're all right. So where did that research come from? Who decided, who went out and asked the folk what their concept of time is? And that was how I identified this massive research gap in philosophy where the fact is we don't know, right? I don't want to say it's entirely undone. There are a couple of philosophers who are working on this, who have done really good work into the folk concept, but it's very, very few and far between. And it feels like most philosophers, when they say, well, this is the folk concept of time, they've kind of just made it up. What they've said is, it's my concept, it's my intuition of what time looks like, and therefore I'm going to apply that to everybody else and say it's their intuition too. And that frustrated me a little bit because I thought, philosophers are people who overthink everything to the nth degree. And to say that we overthink everything when part of our evidence comes from, I just sort of decided that was true and that'll do. I just sort of decided for people and we'll run with that. That was frustrating to me. I was like, no, let's not do that. Let's actually go out and ask the people what their concept is if we're going to use that as evidence to base our theories on. And so that was why Making Time started. It's like, I want to reach out. I want to talk to people and find out what their intuitions are. And that's what I do. I go out and I invite the public to workshops where we discuss my research and we discuss their concepts of what time is. And then we communicate that through different works of art. I suppose there are a couple of reasons why I chose to do it in that way. I think, firstly, a lot of the language within philosophy is very specific. There's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of groundwork that you need to do, I suppose, in a lot of disciplines, but there's a lot of groundwork that you need to do in order to be able to talk about philosophical concepts. And a lot of people just don't have that groundwork because philosophy is a very specific tradition, right? You tend not to have that language unless you spent a lot of time studying philosophy. So I wanted to bring this to people who wouldn't necessarily have that language, and therefore creating works of art to represent intuition was a really nice way of just bypassing having that language, right? And then the other part of it is, well, having a conception of something is really complicated. As we said earlier, it's both what is the thing is in and of itself, and also how do I treat this thing in my everyday life? And if I put you on the spot and say, Adam, give me your concept of this thing, it's hard for any of us to say, oh, God, okay, well, what do I think it is? How do I treat it in my real life? How do I, it's really hard to do that. And partly because we've not thought about it before, partly because every one of us reacts to things in a certain way that we don't really think about, right? And so I didn't just want to put people on the spot and say, tell me your conception. I want people to be able to grapple with the material, but then have space and time to create something without having to think about how to word it. Just get it out on paper, bring out the pens and the pencils and the paints and the clay and whatever you have, and just let that creative process take over. Enter that flow of creativity and just let whatever's inside you just spill out onto paper, and then we'll just see what happens.
The wrestling with that question of time and how we experience it from a philosophical sense is done quite well through art, because some of the questions that are asked is whether time has a substance, and if that's the case, what is it made out of? How do we know time really exists? Does time have a beginning, or does it have an end? Is it a straight line, a circle, an obelisk, zigzags, whatever? Are there alternate realities? What does it mean to be mindful and living in the now? We say a lot of times, actually, when we're making art, we get lost in time, and we just let time go. We go into the studio at 1 p.m. and then we don't realize that we're getting out and it's 1 a.m. So that can easily happen when you're making art. While that's going on, you have a different maybe concept of time. It's not the concept of time passing from 1 hour to the next, but it's the concept of time involved in the artistic process. There's so many different ways we experience time, and that's really hard to talk about. But I think through the act of doing something and producing visuals, the visual language to depict different experiences of time is very insightful and eye-opening, because you realize there's such a wide range of how people think about that kind of thing. And there's a lot of common ideas about it, but there's also very individual moments where it's very intimate and personal, and through art is illuminated. On that note, I am really interested in some of the thoughts and takeaways from these workshops, the actual artwork that was created, but also the process. Were people discussing the concepts of time while they were creating, and what were the results afterwards? One of the things we talk about in art is a work of art actually complete? And I think this project brings up that philosophical question as well, because when we look at a work that was created in the past, a good example is prehistoric art, which none of us were around for. If you asked me the question that you posed about what is time, first thing off my head would be like this record of existence that we know of. Looking back at prehistory, we do have documentation of human life in the form of art. We can only make theories based on what we know, and that always progresses throughout time, where our theories change, and there's no finite answers to a lot of these questions, although we want there to be. But in general, we have evidence, and then through the course of time and inquiry, we build theories upon that evidence. So I guess going back to that, I'm going on a little philosophical tangent myself, but
it happens a lot with the subject.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating, because you just think about the different ways you conceptualize time, or how time dictates certain ways of thinking. And I'm really interested in any insights or visualizations of time that have come out from this project. What were some of the participants' experiences? Did it change their concepts of time? How do they know when the work of art actually ends? Because after we create the work of art, it goes out in the world for viewers to see. That's the goal that we have as artists, and we want other people to see it. And so that in itself is a time-based process, because in most cases, the artwork outlives its creator, and cultures change, viewpoints change. So someone looking at that work has a different perspective because they're in a different era. I mean, and that's maybe where this idea of the future comes in. Are we actually participating in the future by creating art? I think those would be my thoughts if I was in your workshop. And I'd love to, if you do these workshops virtually, as I create work, my general process is that I'm there in the moment. So, and that's another thing I want to talk about, is like, what does that mean to be in the moment? I try to focus on the materials there at hand. And then afterwards, the critique, you're sort of going back into the past, and it's like a backward design in a way. You're thinking, well, did I accomplish my initial goals? Is this like my sketches or my mock-ups, or did I deviate from that in certain ways? And you assess it that way. So the creation of art is this past, present, and future in all those concepts of time from the philosophical sense that I think was initially posed. I've sort of lost track of what my initial question was, but if you have anything.
That's okay. So I mean, there's so much to unpack there. And I think that's one of the most interesting things for me about this project, is because when I first started it, I think, especially because of the tradition in which I work, and I'm so specific about the questions that I ask in my research, is that I forget that the concept of time actually is fascinating. It's really cool. I forget that a lot. But there's a reason that you can go on so many different tangents, right? And that's because time is integral to pretty much every aspect of our life. And one of the things I was concerned about when I first started this project is, I mean, are people going to find it interesting enough? And then that instantly ceased to be a problem almost instantly, because it of course people are, right? It seeps its way into every aspect of our lives. And as you just said, once you start talking about time, we could go off on tangents for the rest of the week, right? And still not have covered everything. I won't keep you that long, don't worry. But we really could. And so one of the interesting things to me when I set about doing any project, but particularly something like making time, which is the project of mine that involves the most public engagement. Something that was really important to me was trying to find that line between focusing the group discussions where I needed them focused in order to discuss the kind of things that I was interested in my research, but also keeping them loose enough that the participants could go off on certain tangents and show me what they really thought without feeling too constricted by me saying, well, no, I want you to answer this specific question. So getting that line right between the push and pull of being specific but allowing tangents was something that was challenging to get right to start with. So one of the things that I give a bit of an introduction every time I run a workshop. I always run the same workshop every time, so I just repeat it, or at least I repeat the bit that the information that I give across, the parts of my research that I give across. I always make sure they're the same, and that's largely because it's an ongoing project. Every piece of art that gets created in a workshop, I want to make sure that it comes from the same information, at least from where I am, right? In order to make sure that every work of art is responding to the same research. So this is people's interpretation of the exact same thing every time. But obviously that is flawed, because I say something and I put it out to group discussion, and then group discussion is very much influenced by the group that I have, right? So I will be very, really clear from the off, right? What we're going to discuss is what it involves, or what you think it involves for the world to have time, right? For the world to involve time. What are the ingredients of that? So we go through and I'm like, do you think the future exists? Do you think the past exists? Do you think that time genuinely flows? Do you think that the present moment is special? And we talk about all these things. I go through with my analytic philosopher hat on, and I'm very literal about these questions. And then the group takes it wherever they take it, right? With some guidance for me to try to keep it roughly on track, roughly, very rough. But what's really interesting to me is the fact that every group will discuss something slightly different. Because what I suspect is coming out of this project, and the project is ongoing, right? Even the making time part of the project, the public engagement side, is I'm still running these workshops. We're still doing them with different people to get as many responses as we can. So I'm up to about 50 different works of art now. I don't know where I'm going to stop, but I am in no way ready to stop just yet. But what I'm finding is that it looks like there isn't just one folk concept of time, right? It looks like there might be lots of folk concepts of time according to all sorts of different things. So how old people are, whether or not they have kids, whether they are raised in a particular culture, whether they're raised in a particular religion. And I find these things really, really fascinating. And I think that all of our concepts are influenced by the rest of our life. And so we don't just have this shared intuition. Although having said that, there are certain things that come up almost every single workshop. So I run them with a different group every time. And some of the threads that run through them are really interesting. So a few moments ago, you were talking about history, right? And the way that we write history and how that can be subverted. And that's one of the tangents that we almost always end up going down in most of the workshops. And that's really interesting to me because I think within my research, when I talk about the past, I talk about literally the times that are no longer now, right? The times that have been present and are now no longer. And that's a really different thing from history, right? History is the way that we talk about those events and the way that we record those events, which are not literally the events themselves. But history seems to solidify those events, those past times in our mind, and separating those two things out, separating out the literal past from human recorded history, is something we touch on a lot of the workshops that's really interesting. Because what I try to get across to people is this idea that in philosophy, we tend to think that the past genuinely was a certain way, regardless of how we remember it or how it's recorded or what the history books say or anything like that. And that's an interesting one because our concepts of who we are in our societies and everything is unfortunately wrapped up in the way that things are written. And yeah, separating those two things out is an interesting endeavor. I think most people tend to really get it though. Most people are like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that, but yeah, things existed. And they existed in the way that they existed, regardless of how we remember them or think about them, right? There seems to be a shared intuition that, what happened 3 weeks ago is that happened the way that happened, right? Whether we know about it, whether we recorded about it, or even whether anyone was there to see it in the first place, it literally happened. And so, yeah, that's an interesting thing that comes up. Another thing that comes up, I think, is so you were talking a few moments ago about being present and being mindful. This is another concept that comes up loads in group discussions, which I find really interesting. I love discussing this with artists because I find a lot of artists and creatives are really into this idea of being present. I think maybe it's from talking to artists, it's something about the way that they work. They kind of enter a creative flow and they just feel like they're in the present moment with their artwork. But as a philosopher, the idea to me of figuring out what the present is really tricky. And we draw this distinction between the actual present and what we call the spacious present, which is the present, the part that your mind thinks is present, right? So I might say, well, in the present, I'm drinking a cup of coffee, right? And that's my spacious present. That's the present that my mind knows. But within my research, I would say well, that can't be present because there's lots of different bits of time involved in drinking a coffee, right? I have to take my first sip and then my second sip, and then even between sips, I have to pick up the cup and put it down, and time is passing. And every tiny little bit has tiny little bits of past, present, and future in it. And so I find things like mindfulness really tricky. So like, how do I be present? Because any bit of time that I look at feels like it can be divided into a kind of past, present, and future. And that's a kind of interesting mix of perceptions we get when we work in these kind of collaborative ways, and in an interdisciplinary way as well, which is quite fascinating. And then, yeah, from all these discussions, we make artwork together. So one thing I do is, and I was quite firm on this from the beginning, is we make artwork in the sessions, right? So the sessions are 3 hours long, which is a bit intense, but they go fast, I promise. So we have 2 hours where I talk to people about my research, we have group discussions, we chat about it. And then the last hour, I'm like, right, we're all going to sit down and we're going to make some artwork. And whether or not people choose to make artwork is up to them. Everyone has so far, I think, but not everyone will always be in a space to do that, and that's fine. But we literally do it there and then. And it's we have that last hour to create something. And I cut off that point in an hour. And in the beginning, I did have people say, can I go away and think about it for a few weeks and make some work and come back? And I was like, in the nicest way, no, you can't. Because what I want is those immediate intuitions, that gut feeling of, oh, this is what I think, this is it. Like, and if you go away and you think about it for a few weeks, then you'll start theorizing. Whether you're aware of it or not, your brain will be churning and you'll be thinking about it and trying to work it out. And then what you'll produce at the end of that time won't be those gut intuitions, right? It'll be theory. And so, yeah, we literally do it in the session, which is, I don't know, it's really interesting to see people work and to see artists who have that kind of time scale, because a lot of them, as you say, view time very differently in their work. So time is something that might disappear for some artists. You might spend weeks or months or years in a single piece. And there's me saying, you don't have to do something, but if you do, got to be within the next hour. And it's really interesting to see how different artists react to that, because some of them will be like, you can see it. It's like something flips a switch in their mind, and it's them, and say they're working on a piece of paper. If they're painting something, it's them and they're painting, and that's all that seems to exist in their reality at that point. Whereas other artists will be drawing or writing, and they'll be constantly asking me questions throughout that process, trying to get clear on things or understand some things or to show me their way of thinking. And so everyone seems to react to that very differently, which I think in and of itself is interesting, even without everything else that we're running in that session. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
That was a perfect answer. And that got me thinking about a lot from my experiences in education. And as an art educator, that's something that comes up so frequently, what you were describing in the workshops. And I think the beauty of art is that there's no right approach to it. And sometimes the best way is very individual based. We develop a way that works best for us. So whether it is that immediate in art, I guess they say I'm working from my subconscious, which is just without much pretext. You have a prompt and you're going to then respond to it immediately, like you were describing in the workshop. But also your workshop's a mix of both, because you do have that preliminary discussion. So people's minds are focused on one particular concept or theme, and then diverge from that in their own unique ways. So I've been approached by students the same kind of questions. Can I work on this at home, or can I have an extension on this? And, sometimes it depends on what the goal of the project is. And if it's to get an immediate response to a prompt, or to exercise a specific emotional reaction or subconscious reaction to a thought, or just to have someone develop those very critical responses in the immediate present moment and responding to that present inquiry, then no. But of course, making a work of art is interesting because it can take minutes or it can take years. And I think every artist is on that spectrum where they've created work that is quick, and they've also created work that may be ongoing. Some series last throughout their whole lives, or they'll consider, like, even a quick painting a part of this longer process. Working with artists may make this concept of time even more complex and confusing. Or does that add to your thesis about folk time in general? And I'm wondering what assessments you've gotten from these varied responses. Then talk about maybe some of the actual artworks, because I know you have on your website examples of those works of art. Yeah. And so I'm interested in hearing about how those manifested.
No, that's a really good question. So I think firstly, there's quite a lot to unpack, as always. So firstly, I should say, although I'm currently studying within university, the whole of the Art of Time project is a separate side project. It is linked to my research, but not officially. It's purely a passion project. I'm not going to write about it in my thesis or discuss it at university. And the reason I mention that is partly because it's just not going to form that. And partly because the nice thing about it being a passion project is I get to kind of do any assessment of works in my own time, right? Whatever. There's no deadline I need to hit. There's no thesis anyone's expecting me to put out or anything like that. This is going to happen in its own time, and I get to assess it and analyze it in my own time. And I think that's important because I really, really want to give this project the space to grow and thrive on its own. And I really want to make sure that when I do start pulling out any concepts that seem to be communicated, that I'm giving that the time and space to emerge on its own rather than trying to hit any deadlines or anything like that. Another thing that you mentioned, sorry, we'll go on to talk about some specific artworks, but another thing that you mentioned was the way in which people work, right? Is artists seem to have this really specific relationship with time, specific to them, relationship with time in the way that they produce their artworks. And I do like to make the workshops as accessible as possible, but there are certainly artists and creatives who are just like, look, unless I can spend weeks or months thinking about it, I'm not going to produce anything. So the first thing I'll say is you don't have to produce something in the session to come to the session. The session, anyone can come along. That's fine. And in fact, one of the most memorable, I like to call it a work of art, but I'm not sure the person who attended didn't necessarily seem to agree. But one of the things that they did is they were like, well, I'm not sure I can create anything in an hour. That's just, I want to go away and I want to sit with this for weeks and months. And I was like, that's entirely up to you. So what they did is at the end of the session, I should say that all the works of art on the website are things that in the session people have chosen to add into the archive. Not everyone will want to add their work into the archive. That's again something that is entirely optional. So if people want to create something in the workshop and take it away with them, throw it in the bin or burn it in a ritual fire or whatever they want to do with it, that's fine too. But the works are the ones that have been lended to the archive. So say I've got about 50 works at the minute. And so the creative that came along that I was mentioning, she was like, well, I don't know whether to add it into the archive because it doesn't feel like art. And basically what she'd done is through the session, she was taking notes and everything that I was saying. And she ended up with this wonderful piece of paper that was just scribbled notes. And because we have materials out while I discuss it, we get messy and there were like bits of charcoal and crayon and all sorts of stuff all over the piece of paper that she wrote, that she wrote all of her notes on. And she did end up adding that piece. She was like, just have it for the archive. Just it's if you think it's a work of art and it's good enough for the archive, have it. I was like, well, anything is good enough for the archive, firstly, because it's about how that individual person has reacted to the workshop. So it's all completely valid and wonderful. And I adore every single piece that's ever been added to it because I'm just so excited about this. But it doesn't necessarily have to be like this big, profound piece of art where you're like, I'm going to solve all of the mysteries of time in this gorgeous watercolor in the next 60 minutes. It can just be okay, here's just some thoughts I had while we were working on this. Right. And that's just as valid and just as wonderful and shows just as much about what it is that you're trying to communicate, I think. Another part of discussing kind of how long it takes an artist to create is there are some projects as part of the Art of Time series that I work individually on with certain artists. So not everyone wants to come to the workshop, but some people do want to work with me, and I have collaborations where we spend longer doing something. So, for example, I have a collaboration with an artist called Daniel Rapley. We've been working for about 5 years on a particular project that sort of combines my work on all my research on philosophy of time and his methodology of fine art photography. And so 5 years is quite a long time to work on one piece, but it takes as long as it takes in some circumstances. So that is, we don't have anything finished at the moment. We're creating a body of work, and that will take its time. Finished pieces as part of the Making Time workshop series. There aren't any full finished pieces on the website. What is on the website is a kind of zoomed in pictures of very particular parts of each individual's work. And part of the reason I've done that is because I want people to be able to go and look at the website if they want to find out more about it, but I don't want them to be too influenced by what people have previously done in the workshops. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to avoid that entirely because you can see snippets of it, but I just think let's say you're coming to a workshop next week with me, you're coming to one of the Making Time workshops, you've seen 50 works that have already been completed. There's no way that you're not going to be influenced by that a little bit, right?
Right. No, that goes back to that whole idea of looking back in the past, or our concept of the past in written history, and our minds are very susceptible to that. I want to mention it's very important to mention, especially when you're talking to artists and art educators. So I like that idea of just showing, a little bit of it without too much context.
Absolutely, yeah. I kind of want to give people a peek behind the curtain, but I don't want to dictate what they're going to create so much. And in fact, some people are so kind of worried that they're going to be influenced that people will come to the workshops having never seen the website. They're like, I specifically didn't look. I don't want to see it. Some people spend ages on there and they're like, no, I want to see what everybody else has done before me. And that's why we just have these little snippets, little pieces. So it might just be the corner of somebody's work or like a little bit from the middle, just a few centimeters squared of what they've created, just to try not to give too much away, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of really, really interesting works. So I think handing in notes was really interesting. Some people have, I think there was one piece where they kind of ran an experiment, which was quite interesting. So in that hour, they picked up different pens and they were like, okay, we're going to hold the pen on the piece of paper for what I'm going to guess is 30 seconds. And then when I think 30 seconds has passed, I'm going to pull my pen off the paper. And then I'm going to get another pen and I'm going to press that pen to the piece of paper. I'm going to hold it on there for what I think is a minute. I'm not going to time it. I'm just going to do what I think is a minute. And then we have this wonderful experiment as a piece of work where it's just how much time they think has passed with each bit of mark making, which, was wonderful. It was really, really interesting. A couple of people have made some very sculptural pieces. So, for example, I have one person who just spent most of the hour carefully tearing bits of tracing paper really, really slowly into these almost perfect lines. And I was absolutely mesmerized by watching this particular artist's work. It was really fascinating because I don't think I could figure out what they were doing. They were just slowly tearing this paper. I was like, is this a performance piece or is this like, what's going on here? This is really interesting. And then she ended up like layering all these beautiful bits of paper together and created this like very small but very interesting, almost sculptural piece of work. Again, you can see that one on the website. So that was a really interesting one to me as well. There was another piece by someone who doesn't consider themselves an artist or a creative. In fact, they were a psychologist, if I remember correctly. And the psychologist quite literally was just making lots and lots of tally marks as they were waiting, basically kind of waiting for this session to end and making tally marks in a very kind of traditional, I suppose, concept, like a traditional visualization of how we measure time passing. So yeah, there's been loads of interesting pieces of work. Some have related the passage of time back to the natural world. Some of and you know, not everyone is, I suppose, artists in the traditional sense. They say we had a psychologist. I've had some poets, which has been really interesting. So we've had some people write poetry in the sessions. There was a sculptor who came along who just like made a wonderful mess everywhere with paint. That was amazing because we did that particular workshop in a pub, and I don't think the pub were overly impressed by how long it took me to clean it up. So yeah, there's really wonderful works, and I'm just excited to see how many more we're going to have and how much more people do with this.
Yes, I am too. And I really find that fascinating, just looking at the examples, the excerpts of the work that's on your website, the diversity of how people approach that concept of time. And every single act of addressing the theme of time is creative in its own right. And I really love when people are addressing this very common issue, and you have really not one response that's like another. It just really shows how time is such a construct that is so immense. It's so important, and it's so daunting. And it's just like, but everyone is different. And that's the beauty of it, is that we're realizing that, yeah, everyone experiences time in a different way, even though we're under this construct of time that society has placed on us, because there's certain fixated aspects of time that we have to live by in our daily lives. But in the grand scheme of things, the reality of time is that there's a lot of how we experience time that cannot be neatly organized or described. Time is not fixated in that sense. And it's a good point to bring up how education cannot be neatly compacted by these traditional notions or these standardized methods of measuring time, because it's a growth process and has the past, present, and future all wrapped up in the way we teach and we learn. And it's very organic in that it changes, and you see different people learning throughout history in different eras, and they talk about their experiences in school, and it's different. But yeah, I want to talk about two last things. But first, I want to talk about your own work of art, and it's a video work of art. It was your first work of art, and it was created just last year. So
yeah, that's right.
I guess I want to talk about that a little bit. First of all, if you could describe it, maybe what it is physically or visually, the process behind it, and then the context too, and how the process of making art was either similar or different to the process of how you would work as a philosopher.
Yeah, so yes, I did create my first solo piece last year, which was a real big deviation from the way that I work. I think it's been coming for a little while. So as I say, with making time, I've been working with creatives a lot more through my collaboration with Daniel Rapley. I'd say he kind of got me started on making, because every project I'd worked on up until that point, I was very clear on my role. I was like, my role is the philosopher and your role is the artist, and I'm going to take the lead with the conceptual stuff, and you're going to take the lead with the creative stuff. And one thing I do with making time particularly, but also some other projects, is I say, well, I don't want to get involved in the creative process, right? So I'm gonna do all the conceptual stuff. We're going to talk about that as much as you like, for as long as you like, and then you're going to make the art, right? I don't want to get involved in that, because I was interested in how artists would take my research and what they would do with it. And I thought, well, if I get involved in the making process, then I'm not really seeing what they would do with it. I'm seeing kind of a warped version of me sort of influencing their version of it, if that makes sense. And when I started working with Daniel Rapley, he was like, well, that's not going to work for me. He's like, we both get involved in the conceptual side and the making, and that's how it's going to work. And I was terrified, because this was 5 years ago. I came from the sort of background where it was like, if you do something creative, it better be perfect. or there's no point, and I was really nervous of being creative. I was nervous about being artistic because the idea of experimenting and getting something wrong was foreign to me. It's not to artists, which is kind of a big reason of why I love working with them. They're like, who cares if we think this concept might be wrong? Let's just play with it and we'll see what comes out of it. And oh my God, this is so freeing. And so Daniel was the first person who was like, listen, if we're going to be in this, we're going to be in this together from the beginning. You've got to come, you've got to work with me. And the way that he works is all practice-led research anyway. So although a lot of our collaboration is underpinned by my research, it's really led by Daniel's practice. And so I had to get stuck in and start doing some creative stuff. And then over a few years of doing that, and then starting making time, I've slowly been like, well, maybe I'll just try doing a few creative bits just to see. And then, that kind of evolved into my first solo piece, Fluxus Temporis, or The Flow of Time, which did last year. So I came up with the concept, and then I was supported by an artist called Benjamin Rostance, who was the artist who helped me film, because as you'll see, I'm kind of in the piece, so I couldn't film the piece. So he was, but very much took over cinematography, which is really helpful. And the concept behind the piece is the idea that we try to, as time as a concept, we really try to pin it down, and we try our best to manipulate it, mold it, to pause certain moments or to hang on to certain moments, or to try to just stop it so we can figure out what's going on, right? And the kind of conclusions I've come to as a researcher on my PhD, and this is just, my theory, it's not indicative of all the theories about time, but my theory is just that there is something fundamentally dynamic about time, right? That it's not something that's static. It's not like a series of photographs in a book. It is a thing that is fundamentally in flux. It moves no matter what we do with it. We can't pin it down. We can't try to focus on any bits of it. We can't stop it from escaping us, right? And so for me, I was really interested in this idea that we really, really, really try to divert the flow of time, but the flow of time is inexorable. It's just, it seems like such a fruitless task, but one that we can't stop trying to accomplish. And I'm really, really interested in our relationship with time in that way. And I've been trying for a long time throughout my PhD thesis to cash that out in writing, to write essays about that, or my whole first chapter is about that, and I still don't feel like I've been able to capture it in the way that I want. And so eventually I was like, you know what, I'm going to make a video, I'm going to make a film piece that will try to capture that. And I don't know how successfully it does it. But yeah, so we went out to this huge waterfall in Derbyshire, and I spent hours clambering around in the water trying to find the perfect spot. And then we found this perfect little waterfall, and the film is just a close-up of this little, 5-6 inch waterfall, and we just watch it move. And this is very representative of the way that we think about the flow of time, or the way that I think about the flow of time, certainly. And then after a few moments, so my hands will come into shot, and they just explore the water for a few minutes, like just moving around. What is it? What's going on? And then as I get comfortable, it's, can I stop it? Can I cup it up and then let it go? Can I save some of it from falling? And we have this lovely kind of, well, I think it's lovely, but it's my work, so I'm going to think that. We have this lovely kind of explorative moments where I'm just trying to see how much I can manipulate or stop this flow. And as the film goes on, it almost gets a little bit, the movements get a little bit faster as I'm trying to dam this tiny waterfall, right? It's slightly wider than my hands, so I can't quite get enough of my hand in to stem this flow, to get it to stop, to just pause the present moment for a second, so we can take some time to appreciate it or figure it out or know what's going on. And the flow of water over my hands is just relentless. And so that's what I was trying to communicate through this piece. It's my first ever piece, so I'm not expecting it to be particularly accomplished at the moment, but I hope to continue working on some solo pieces in the future, and also to continue working more collaboratively, but in a more hands-on, creative way as well. Which I do have some things in the works with that to see if I can continue progressing in that kind of way.
I think that piece is a great metaphor for everything we've been talking about, and a visualization of the enormity of this subject and the attempts that we make in our everyday life to sort of control time. And it's ongoing, as the work of art that you created, the flow of time, would suggest. I mean, it's been ongoing, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about life, is that we see this continuum, and it's represented through the visual vocabulary of art. It's very meditative too, and I enjoy watching, just your hand moving along the water. It's very visually compelling as well as philosophically. We started by talking about ways in which you are looking to make philosophy accessible. And throughout our discussion, it's clear that you're doing that. And the way you've explained it to me, someone who, unfortunately, to admit that I fell asleep a lot of times during the philosophy classes that I was meant to take in undergrad. And it wasn't until, I started becoming my path to become an art historian and educator, where I got back into all different aspects of philosophy and actually reading it and spending the time on it, because didn't feel forced at that time. But anyway, digressing from that, your explanations of both the analytical and the continental, words, if I just read it on a page, and I have read it on a page in the past, and it just didn't seep in. But the way you've described it was perfect. It was accessible. I understood those concepts. And then your description of the project you're doing, the art project you're doing, further gave me a visualization or a more concrete understanding of something that's so differentiated and abstract and so widely discussed over the course of centuries and centuries with opposing viewpoints. So it's really both a testament to art helping us to develop more differentiated but also more tangible understandings of it. And then how you're approaching it is great from an educational standpoint, because I really appreciate the way you are working within academia, but also that the reality is that not everyone is in academia. It's a very small percentage of the population, and your passion is to make this complex hermetic knowledge accessible to us all. I really think that's needed, because philosophy is such an important subject and one that's intrinsic to our lives. So my parting question is on that note is, what's one thing about philosophy that you'd like the general public to know that we might not know or consider already?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, there are so many potential answers to that question. And I suppose maybe my answer would focus on accessibility, right? So you're right. So I do personally focus on accessibility in what I do. I try to find lots of different ways to talk about my research and to show my research. So it's not just in discussions. There'll be, I'll draw pictures, or I'll make models to demonstrate things, or we'll use examples from popular culture to help people kind of understand what it is I'm talking about. I also run like one-to-ones for artists. So if they have a particular thing in like their own artwork that they want to explore and they just don't know where to start, then I'll tailor make them like hey, this is what the philosophers say about the concepts that you're dealing with. But I think the thing that I want people to know about philosophy is that doesn't happen very often with philosophy, that somebody will come out and be like, you know what, it is a privilege that I have this research, and why shouldn't you be invited into that as well if I can do that for you? And so if you're wanting to look into philosophy and you're struggling with it and you're finding it inaccessible or you're finding it hard to read, that's not your fault, right? It's the most important takeaway. So you're saying like you're falling asleep in your classes. I meet a lot of people who especially come to me for like one-to-one sessions who will say, I tried to read this philosopher and it was just so hard to get into. I'm like, yeah, it was. And that's not your fault. That's largely the fault of the field itself. So philosophy tends to be written, I find, in quite exclusionary ways, right? It uses the language of the discipline, which is not unusual, but I think the frustrating thing is it doesn't always have to, right? It could say things in a simple way and it chooses not to. They will throw in a lot of Latin terms. That's really common for philosophy. Is, hey, let's just throw out some Latin for no reason, right? But just because it sounds fancy, so we're just going to throw that in there. Also, reading philosophy is a skill, right? It's not like reading anything else. It's not like picking up a novel or picking up a science book or picking up anything else. There is a methodology and a method to reading philosophy that if you don't already know it, is going to be really, really hard for you to read it. It doesn't mean that you can't do it or that you're somehow less intelligent because you can't do it. It's just that you haven't learned that skill yet, or no one's taken the time to teach you that skill. So if you're going to read philosophy, firstly, there are lots of introductory books out there. Secondly, there are people like me who you can reach out to and just be like, look, I tried to read this guy and it's like, can you just tell me? And I'll be like, yeah, sure, I'll tell you, no problem. And then the other thing is, if you are going to read a philosophy book, take your time, read it a little bit at a time. Like even sometimes I will read like a paragraph at a time and I'll get to the end of that paragraph and I'll pause. And then I'll read it again slower and I'll make notes. And this is even after like 15 years of reading philosophy. So I'll make notes as I go, and then I will look up anything that I didn't understand, any terms that are unfamiliar. And then when I know all the terms that are unfamiliar, then I'll go through and I'll read it again. And hopefully the third time is where the understanding will start to sink in, right? But if you just sit and you read a whole philosophy book cover to cover and you're like, I didn't understand that. Most of the time, philosophers don't either reading it like that, right? They won't tell you this, but we don't understand it either when we do that. Yeah, it's a really, really slow process of doing it. So yeah, just try not to feel like it's not for you if you've tried it and it hasn't worked. It's just because it's a skill like any other, and you can learn that skill. And if you're struggling, you can reach out for help.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kerry. This has been such an enlightening and inspiring conversation, and I am looking forward to seeing how it progresses over time. So,
yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to speak to you. Thank you.